So we don't have really good numbers on domestic adoptions. The federal government no longer tracks domestic infant adoption placements, and it's actually very hard to get an infant private adoption count as opposed to step parent adoptions or second parent adoptions, which are of course very experientially different from a domestic infant adoption that separates children from their families of origin. We found that it was about 0.5% of births in the United States were led to a domestic infant adoption placement. So, half of 1% of all infants born were relinquished as newborns or infants for domestic adoption placement. There's really no reason that the government isn't tracking this or analyzing this, at least on a state by state level, in some way. And it's unfortunate that we have to rely on people who are facilitating adoptions for really any large scale information about who's participating in the system. It's really important to understand that women of every demographic category are far more likely to either have an abortion or to parent than they are to relinquish, right? So I can tell you some commonalities that the women who do relinquish have, um, but given its rarity, any other option is more common for any of these categories that I'm going to be talking about, right? So when you look at birth mothers, or first mothers, relinquishing mothers from kind of the pre-Roe time, the girls who went away, the baby scoop era, these women were pretty overwhelmingly white women. A lot of them were younger. These were their first pregnancies, and they were relinquishing as a way of deferring parenthood until they were married, right? That single motherhood and non-marital pregnancy and motherhood were so heavily stigmatized that wasn't an option for them. Abortion was illegal, and oftentimes this was a way of them not being mothers until they were at a different point in their life. Not of their own volition often, but that was still sort of the framework. If you cannot be a mother now, thus this adoption will sort of defer that path until later. This is not what we see about mothers today. So relinquishing mothers today they're still majority white, but it's only about a little bit over half. So we see a lot more women of color that are relinquishing. We also see that a lot more women who are already parenting children are relinquishing. So this adoption is no longer a way of deferring motherhood. They're already raising kids. What I think that reflects is that adoption is really an expression of financial resourcelessness and powerlessness. They feel that they cannot afford another child, that's where they're coming from, and they don't have the social support, the familial support, the support in their relationships, to be able to care for another child the way that they would like to. And really, poverty is sort of the most overwhelming defining characteristic of relinquishment right now. So most birth mothers today are making or reporting less than about $5,000 in annual personal income, right? So it's not even just living below the poverty line; they are well below the poverty line. Now that's personal income. We don't have data on household income. So they could be getting support from their own parents. They could be getting support from a partner. There are other potential sources of income that aren't reflected in those data. But I think it's important to remember that this is the money that they control. This is the money that they are bringing in, that they have power over to sort of shape the course of their lives and their children's lives. And it is extremely limited. We also see high rates of homelessness, recurrent chronic poverty among relinquishing mothers. And like as I mentioned at the start, it's important to remember that the vast majority of women who are living in poverty in this country, who are experiencing this sort of inequity and these challenges, are parenting, right? It's not that most poor women are choosing this, but it is that most women who choose this are poor. The lack of a social safety net is a huge reason why we see adoptions existing at all in this country. That if we had a greater amount of investment in families and parents and made that more tenable for them, you would see much less adoption. But I also think it's not just the availability of a social safety net, I mean, which we certainly need, but it's also the accessibility of that safety net, the stigma that's currently attached to it. So there are some women who take a lot of pride in relinquishing their child rather than availing themselves of social support that they knew was available because the stigma attached to needing help to support your family and parent a child that you would otherwise want to parent is so high. And we have to not just increase the social support, but we have to increase acceptance of that. We have to make it more comfortable for people to need a little help. This country makes it very, very, very hard to be a parent. And it also makes it very stigmatized, embarrassing, shaming, marginalizing to need help to get through that system. And so it's not just a function of increasing the resources that are available, but it's about acknowledging that we live in a world that makes parenting hard and needing help is common and not something that makes you a bad parent. A lot of the mothers I've spoken with have said, if I couldn't have an open adoption, I wouldn't have relinquished, right? And so I do think that it's important to recognize that adoption, the availability of open adoption is an effective way of making adoption more appealing to pregnant women who are in crisis. Um, and that they would not consider a closed adoption. And so having an open adoption leads them more in those conversations. And of course, there's no legal protection for openness in many of these circumstances. And I will finally add that openness is not one thing, right? I mean, I have spoken with mothers who live in the same town as their child and their child's adoptive family, who babysit for them, who go on family vacations with them, who are sort of this idyllic extended family idea of open adoption. And so you can have openness that works, and then you can have openness that doesn't work. I think openness that I think that the sort of extended kinship scenario that I first mentioned is extraordinarily rare. But I think when pregnant people who are facing a crisis are sold on adoption, they are painted this sort of very open communication, kinship picture as the norm, and it's not the norm. And it has no protection. It's totally up to the discretion of adoptive parents in most cases. And so I think we really need to think very critically about how adoption is used to make it more appealing for people, and then how there's very little protection, very little support for birth parents and adoptive families in negotiating these ongoing relationships over the course of a lifetime. And then we have to remember that isn't determined, isn't entirely protective, right? Like, these women are still experiencing a loss and a trauma. Like, openness doesn't fix that. I see the vast majority of adoptions that happen in this country as a failure to support families rather than a successfully averted abortion, or rather than a successfully made family. I see it as our inability to keep families together the way that they would most frequently like to be kept together. And so I think we need to offer that as an alternative. As our elected leaders, continually, and this is bipartisan, this isn't just a conservative, right? Our elected leaders have always had this idea of adoption as a social good, as a mutually agreeable common ground in a lot of these conversations. And instead, we need to come to understand adoption as our failure to support families, and work to mitigate that. I think that it's important to understand agency dynamics as well, and the power dynamics there. I've talked with a lot of mothers who feel like they have very little support. And this isn't just about money, but they don't have support from their partner. They don't have support from their own parents. They don't have a supportive extended family. They don't really have anyone in their lives who's saying, like, you can get through this, you can do this, right? They don't have anyone that they can to kind of talk to and just be like, yeah, this is going to be hard. This is going to be a lot of work. Parenting is a lot of work. It's, we have no money. It's, but like, we can figure this out, right? Nobody's sort of coming and offering them that support. And adoption agencies often are the only place that they feel like they have someone to really talk to about the complicated feelings they're having about their pregnancy, about the fact that they don't quite know what to do. And, many adoption agencies view adoption not just as a solution to a crisis pregnancy, but they have waiting families that they believe are a better place for this child. And so they are motivated not to help pregnant people who are in crisis figure out the best solution for themselves and their child. They are motivated to frame adoption as that best choice. And, more often than not. And I think that is another power dynamic when you have people who are in a really vulnerable place coming to you, and you have a particular framework for what is going to be best for them and their kid. That's a huge power dynamic that we don't look at. And that doesn't even get into like all of the advertising that happens, right? I can pull up the Google AdWord ad buys that adoption agencies are buying. Not always adoption specific Google search terms. So you can Google like support for pregnant women or support for single moms or homeless and pregnant in this state or this city or whatever, and you'll get an adoption agency Google ad. Right? And if you are a pregnant person who's in crisis and trying to find housing, trying to find support, trying to get on WIC, trying to figure out how to make this work, and an adoption agency ad pops up and you click on it and you see these really compelling profiles of adoptive families with their nice houses and their big backyards and their pictures of their Sunday dinners with families and cousins, right? That's what you want for your child. You can't give that to them right now. And it becomes really compelling very quickly. And so many of them I talk to, almost this like headiness of like falling in love with their child's adoptive parents, right? Kind of as they're looking at profiles, like feeling very starstruck in a lot of ways. Like, oh, these people they're going to come in and save the day, right? Like, look at what they can give my child. That's what I want for my child. I want them to have this big backyard and these older siblings and this great neighborhood with these amazing schools and these family vacations. And it quickly becomes a relationship that is imbued with a lot of those ideas of who's a deserving parent and what a child needs. And I think that it's hard to pull them out of that. In the jobs oral arguments, as Justice Coney Barrett is talking about safe haven relinquishment as an alternative to abortion, even setting aside, and you can't set it aside, but for the sake of this conversation, like setting aside the risks incurred by pregnancy, and also the fact that most people getting abortions just don't want to be pregnant, the burden of pregnancy and birth is too much to set aside and just say like, oh, well, safe haven, relinquishment is the solution here. But even if we assume, like the justice, that we're operating on the premise that that's not an additional burden, safe haven relinquishments are almost never used. We have so little information about who is using them and the circumstances under which they are. So if we look at planned domestic adoption relinquishments, right? If we look at the women who I'm interviewing and speaking with, again, they're coming from like relatively, certain like comparable poverty when you look at adoptive families. They're coming from places where they don't feel like they have a lot of choices available to them, and this is kind of the crisis response. When you look at safe haven laws, I can only infer that those women are facing this similar crises, but probably to a greater degree, right? And so when I speak with mothers who make kind of last minute or in hospital or immediately post-delivery adoption relinquishments, which I think are probably most comparable to safe haven relinquishments, those are women who are facing like domestic violence situations, severe homelessness, often late gestational age discovery of pregnancy. Like they didn't know they were pregnant until pretty soon before delivery. And so they just don't have a plan, right? They haven't been able to plan for parenthood. And no one says, okay, well, like the baby's here now, like let's slow down and make a plan. They've just given birth to a baby that they may or may not have known was coming for very long. Um, and the adoption seems like, okay, well, I have a baby now, I have to do something, right? And let's call the adoption agency, right? And they don't get the counseling around like, okay, well, let's put this baby in, a crisis nursery or cradle care for a week, take a breath, and imagine what support you would need to parent or connect you with other sorts of support that you might be interested in, right? So if you kind of tap into that like crisis moment of like, I have a newborn and I have to get rid of them right away because I don't know, I wasn't prepared, I don't know what to do. They're trying to keep that child safe in a lot of ways. They might be facing violence at home, they might be facing addiction themselves, homelessness. But what is striking to me about those scenarios is that the support is all about the baby. So many mothers who are facing domestic violence or unhealthy or unsafe relationships, the social support takes the baby, puts the baby with another family, and then the mothers are going right back to the same unsafe situations, right? And to me, when women are coming from this crisis, that's an opportunity to care for both the mother and the child. And this is almost regardless of whether or not an adoption happens, right? That the mother's and the woman's life has value also. There should be a societal investment in keeping her safe, in helping her deal with her addiction, in getting her housed and sheltered, in figuring out how to change the circumstances of her life that are putting her at risk in addition to her child, right? Whether or not an adoption is happening. And so when we look at safe haven laws, I sort of see them as most comparable to these true immediate crises, right, soon after delivery. And because they are, as a function, designed to be anonymous, we don't know very much about them, which means that they can then be used to hide any sort of other crisis that's happening. So what if the mother is relinquishing at a safe haven because she's not safe? What if she's relinquishing at a safe haven because her boyfriend is forcing her to, or because this baby was a result of sexual assault, or any number of scenarios in which the safe haven relinquishments don't allow us to find ways of serving the mothers who are in crisis themselves. And again, I'm setting aside the huge issue of the fact that they don't allow for openness, that they don't allow for ongoing contact, that they deny the child the right to know their own genetic, and familial history, right? Like those are other violations that kind of, are sequely to these types of relinquishments. But when we look at the immediate crisis of safe haven use, we should think about it not as a way of averting abortions, because I don't think many of those women were going to get an abortion. But we should think of it as a way of just society trying to wash our hands of taking care of vulnerable pregnant people and vulnerable people who have just given birth.